The Bitterroot Valley in January holds its breath. Snow covers everything, the ridge lines the frozen creek beds, the roads that stop being roads, somewhere past the last house with lights in the windows. Up here, silence has weight. Up here, the mountain keeps its secrets the way old wood keeps its grain deep, patient, indifferent to how long it takes. Somewhere on that ridge, a cabin stands at the end of a dirt track no county map bothers to name. Its roof bows under accumulated winters. Its windows hold the dark like closed eyes. Inside, under the floorboards, something has been waiting. A truck moves through the storm now, small, struggling. Its headlights cut a narrow channel through the white, and the white closes back behind it like water. The cabin appears at the clearing's edge. The door opens, and 50 years of silence finally hears footsteps overhead. The Bitterroot Valley in January holds its breath. Snow covers everything, the ridge lines, the frozen creek beds, the roads that stop being roads somewhere past the last house with lights in the windows. Up here silence has weight. Up here the mountain keeps its secrets the way old wood keeps its grain, deep, patient, indifferent to how long it takes. Somewhere on that ridge, a cabin stands at the end of a dirt track no county map bothers to name. Its roof bows under accumulated winters. Its windows hold the dark like closed eyes. Inside, under the floorboards, something has been waiting. A truck moves through the storm now, small, struggling. Its headlights cut a narrow channel through the white, and the white closes back behind it like water. The cabin appears at the clearing's edge. The door opens, and 50 years of silence finally hears footsteps overhead. There was a woman who walked into an auction house on the coldest morning of January with 50 cents in her pocket and bid on something nobody else wanted. A deed to a broken-down cabin on a ridge so remote the county hadn't bothered to pave the road leading to it. People laughed, not politely, not quietly, the kind of laughter that fills a room and stays there long after the joke is gone. But what they didn't know was that under the floorboards of that cabin, buried beneath decades of silence and frozen earth, something was waiting. Something that had been waiting for exactly the right person to come along and be desperate enough to listen. Before we go any further, if stories like this mean something to you, if you believe that truth has a way of surviving even when everything else burns down, take a moment and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means we can keep telling stories worth remembering. Now, let's go back to that auction house, back to Clara Bennett, back to the morning her life changed for the second time in less than a year, only this time she was the one who chose it. The auction was held in a converted grain warehouse on the edge of Hamilton, Montana, the kind of building that smelled like cold metal and old hay no matter the season. Folding chairs had been arranged in uneven rows. A propane heater rattled in the corner, working hard and accomplishing little. Coffee sat in a silver urn near the entrance, burnt and forgotten. Clara arrived late. Not because she'd overslept, but because she'd spent 20 minutes sitting in the parking lot in her truck, trying to decide if she was making the worst mistake of her life or simply the latest in a long series of them. The truck's heater had given out somewhere around Missoula 3 weeks ago, and she hadn't had the money to fix it. She wore 2 coats. Eli sat beside her in the passenger seat. 12 years old and wrapped in a sleeping bag, she'd bought second-hand at a church sale, reading a paperback with a cracked spine and the patience of someone twice his age. He'd get that from his father, people used to say. Clara had stopped correcting them. She climbed out of the truck and told him to stay put and stay warm. He looked up from his book, his eyes hazel green, the same shade as hers, though neither of them talked about that anymore, held the kind of steadiness that made her chest ache. He nodded once and went back to reading. Inside the auction was already moving through its inventory. Old farm equipment, a decommissioned postal van, 3 lots of tools from an estate sale up near Derby. Clara took a seat near the back and pulled a folded piece of paper from her inner coat pocket. She'd found the listing 3 days earlier tucked into the back pages of a county property newsletter she'd picked up at the library while using their Wi-Fi to submit job applications. Lot 47, 1-room cabin structure and associated land parcel, Willow Creek Ridge, Bitterroot Valley, condition uninhabitable, road access seasonal and unimproved, no utilities, no water connection on record, minimum bid $1. She'd read it 4 times. The word uninhabitable had not discouraged her. She had been living in her car for 11 days. When Lot 47 came up, the auctioneer read it out with the bored efficiency of a man who'd already sold 20 things that morning and had 17 more to go. A few people in the front rows glanced at each other. Someone near the window said something Clara didn't catch, but the laughter that followed was unmistakable. No one raised a hand. Clara waited. 3 seconds. 5. The auctioneer looked up. She raised her hand and said 50 cents. Flat. No apology in it. The laughter came again, fuller this time, rippling back through the rows. The man beside her in a vest and Reeves mining cap leaned away as if poverty might be contagious. The auctioneer blinked, looked at his clipboard, looked at her. The room waited for the punchline. There wasn't one. The hammer came down. She walked to the clerk's table and placed 2 quarters on the counter. The woman behind the desk stared at them for a moment, then slid the deed across. It was a single page, folded in thirds, soft at the creases from years in a file drawer. Clara tucked it into her coat without looking at it again. She went back outside to the truck. Eli looked up. His bookmark, a flattened gum wrapper, went between the pages. She held up the folded paper without speaking. He studied her face for a moment, then quietly, "So we have a place to go." She started the engine. "We have a place to go." The road to Willow Creek Ridge was a suggestion more than a road. Gravel that had given up being gravel somewhere in the middle distance and become instead a series of ruts and frozen puddles and the memory of tire tracks. Snow had been falling since noonlight at first, then committed. The truck's headlights cut a narrow channel through the white, and beyond the channel the forest closed in tight pine and fir, so dense they seemed to lean toward each other overhead, blocking what little remained of the late afternoon sky. The GPS had stopped tracking 20 minutes back. No signal. Clara drove by the deeds attached directions, hand-printed on a strip of paper that had been stapled to the corner. Left at the split pine. Follow the creek bed half a mile. Do not attempt in wet season. It was not wet season. It was something considerably worse. She felt the truck's back end drift slightly on a patch of ice and corrected without thinking, the way you do after enough winters. Eli had his forehead against the cold window, watching the trees. "Do you think anyone's been here recently?" he asked. "No," she said. "That's the point." He considered this. "Is that good or bad?" She kept her eyes on the ruts. "Ask me again in the morning." The cabin appeared at the end of a clearing, like something from a photograph taken a long time ago and left in a drawer. It was smaller than the listing's description had suggested, which was already modest. The roof bowed in the middle under the weight of accumulated winters. The porch leaned left, and two of the steps had buckled and split. The window shutters hung at wrong angles, some open, some half-closed, swinging faintly in the wind. Eli looked through the windshield for a long moment. "It's smaller than the pictures," he said. "Pictures lie," Clara said. "Let's go look." The door opened with the groan of wood that had swollen and dried and swollen again too many times. The air inside was cold, as the outside may be colder, the particular chill of a space that had been sealed from the sun for too long. It smelled of mildew and something animal long gone, but not entirely. A mouse crossed the far corner of the room and disappeared behind the baseboards without ceremony. Eli's flashlight swept across the space. A fireplace of stacked river stone, its mortar cracked, but the structure standing. A table with a broken leg propped against the wall. Floors covered in pine needles and old newspapers gone gray with age. A tin lantern hanging from a ceiling beam, empty. Something in the far hallway shifted. A low sound, not loud. A settling maybe, or something beneath the floor adjusting to weight it hadn't felt in years. Eli's flashlight stopped moving. "Did you hear that? Old houses breathe," Clara said. "Come on, let's get the boxes." They worked until the light was gone from the sky, carrying in the few things they owned. 2 duffel bags, a cardboard box of kitchen supplies, a camp stove, sleeping bags, the box of Eli's books. Clara swept the cleanest section of floor and laid out their bedding while Eli assembled the camp stove on the table. The water she'd brought in a jug she heated for instant oatmeal. They ate by the light of the tin lantern, which she'd fitted with a tea candle from the bottom of one of the bags. After Eli was asleep, curled deep in his sleeping bag, with the practiced ease of someone who had been sleeping in strange places for weeks, Clara sat alone by the fireplace. She'd managed to get a small fire going with the driest of the wood scraps she'd found stacked under the back porch. It gave more smoke than heat, but the light was steady. She pulled out her journal. It had been a birthday gift from Eli 2 years ago, back when birthdays still involved gifts. The leather cover was worn soft. She opened it to a fresh page and wrote, "By firelight." January 6th. Arrived at the cabin. Roof unstable, fireplace functional. Water source unknown. Condition worse than expected. Plan inspect structure at first light. Locate spring. Begin repairs. She paused, then added a line she hadn't planned. Found initials carved on the window sill. STR. Someone was here before us. Someone who wanted to be remembered. She'd noticed them only by accident, the lantern light catching the lines in the wood at just the right angle. 3 letters cut deliberately, not by a knife in a moment of boredom, but carefully with the patience of someone who had something they needed to mark. She had traced them with one finger. The wood was cold and smooth around the letters, but inside the cuts rough still, old but not ancient. She looked at the sleeping shape of her son. "We're going to make it," she said very quietly to the room. "We have to." The fire cracked once, throwing a spray of sparks against the stone. The back hallway made it sound again, not the wind. Something else, something underneath. Morning came gray and brittle, the sky the color of old pewter, the frost on the windows so thick it blurred the tree line into impressionism. Clara rose before Eli and got the camp stove going, boiling water for instant coffee. The smell filled the cabin the way warmth fills a cold hand slowly. Then, all at once, she was sweeping pine needles from the back hallway when she found them. Under the collapsed chair in the old kitchenette, crushed by a beam that had fallen and been left, was a sheaf of paper held together by a rusted binder clip. Receipts mostly. Old ones. Dates from the early 1960s. Each one stamped with the same name in red ink. Samuel T. Reeves Mining Corporation. She stood for a long moment holding the papers. Then she looked at the windowsill across the room, at the 3 letters carved into the wood. STR Samuel T. Reeves. She was still standing there when Eli appeared in the hallway doorway, jacket half-zipped, hair unmade. "Mom," he said, pointing past her toward the back of the cabin. "Come see something." He led her out through the rear door and around the side of the building to where the land rose toward the ridge. The morning light had found a specific angle on the slope, one that would have been invisible an hour earlier or an hour later, and in that light she could see clearly what Eli had spotted from the porch step. Stones, flat stones set deliberately into the earth in a line that curved up the hillside, not a natural formation, too even, too intentional, too carefully spaced. They caught the low winter sun and gave it back in a way that ordinary ground did not. Eli stood with his hands in his pockets, his breath clouding in the cold. "Someone built that," he said. Clara studied the line of stones. They disappeared into the tree line at the top of the slope, but their direction was unmistakable. Maybe it's just an old marker, she said. Property line, something like that. Then why does it look like an arrow? She didn't have an answer for that. They went back inside, and Clara told herself they'd follow the stones when the more immediate problems were managed. The roof, the water source, the floor in the back room that flexed dangerously underfoot. There was an order to survival, and it didn't begin with stone trails on hillsides. But she kept glancing toward the ridge through the frosted window. The back room was where she spent the rest of the morning, smaller than the main room, nearly bare. An overturned dresser, a built-in shelf along the far wall, mounted deep into the logs. The floor sloped slightly toward the left corner boards, dry and dark with age, the color of old honey. Dust coated everything in a layer thick enough to suggest the room had been sealed and ignored for a very long time. Eli came in while she was examining the shelf. "It's deep," he said, crouching to look, "way deeper than it should be." He pressed his hand against the wall behind it. "And this part of the wall, it's different. The boards are newer. Somebody added this after the cabin was built." Clara stepped closer. He was right. The wall behind the shelf had been constructed with different lumber, slightly lighter in color, the grain running in the opposite direction from the original logs. The joins were uneven, hurried. "And look here." Eli pointed to the baseboard where the wall met the floor, faint markings half worn away by time and mouse traffic. Letters, STR. Clara felt something shift in the room, not a sound. A presence, maybe, the sense of a hand placed on a wall years ago, and the wall still warm from it. "Third time," she said quietly. Eli looked up. He really wanted someone to know he was here. Then the floor spoke. A sharp snap from somewhere beneath their feet, not a creak, not a settling groan, but the clean sound of wood yielding a hollow echo underneath it that meant empty space below. Clara stepped back instinctively. Eli's flashlight rolled from his hand and came to rest at the edge of the sloped section, its beam pointing down at a gap barely visible at the corner of a plank. Clara knelt. She ran her fingers along the edge of the board. It wasn't nailed. One corner lifted with only slight pressure, the wood swollen but not fixed. She reached into her jacket pocket for the multi-tool she'd carried since the divorce, the one thing she hadn't let go of, no matter how many boxes she'd had to leave behind. The board came up with a reluctant creak, then popped free. Beneath it, a cavity shallow but long-running along the wall's base. And inside it, arranged with deliberate care, wrapped in oiled canvas that had gone dark and stiff with age bundles. Dozens of them, some flat like folders, others rigid book-shaped, all of them tied with cord. Eli leaned in. "Whoa," he said, very softly, the way he said things when he was trying not to disturb something. Clara lifted the nearest bundle and set it on the floor. The canvas flaked at the edges when she unwrapped it. Inside, a collection of documents, topographic maps, covered in hand-penciled notations, geological charts, with sample codes running down the margins, typed letters on letterhead that had gone translucent with age, and at the corner of every page, either stamped or written in the same precise hand, Samuel T. Reeves. He wasn't a ghost. He was a man. A real man who had worked in this room, who had pressed pen to paper at some table that no longer existed, who had wrapped these documents with care and sealed them beneath the floor of a cabin he believed no one would ever find. Clara sat back on her heels. The first twist of understanding moved through her like cold water. This was not junk, not a forgotten pile of personal papers. This was organized, purposeful, hidden with intention by a man who had known exactly what he was hiding and why. "What do we do?" Eli asked. "We go through it," she said, "carefully, and we don't tell anyone outside this cabin." She held his gaze. "Not yet." He straightened, nodded with the gravity of someone who understood the weight of a secret. "Secret stash rules," he said. "Got it." They worked through the afternoon, sorting everything onto the main room table by firelight. The maps were geological surveys, detailed and annotated, covering the ridge and the valley below it, in a grid of red ink notations. Sample labels, small rock fragments in sealed glass jars, each labeled with codes and measurements. Letters in tight cursive, some to unnamed recipients, some fragments of correspondence that had lost their other halves. The dates ranged from 1961 to 1968. And at the bottom of the cavity, bundled separately from everything else and wrapped twice over in heavier canvas, a notebook. Small, leather-bound, the cover cracked and water-stained at the edges but intact. It opened easily. The first entry, August 4th, 1963. Clara read it by the fire, while Eli categorized samples with the focused attention he reserved for things he found genuinely important. Second core sample, positive. Signs of silver veining present at lower elevations. Don't trust Thomas. He's pushing for signatures too fast. Says we can't afford another winter without movement. I say we can't afford selling out. She turned pages. The entries grew longer as the years moved forward, and the tone shifted from scientific notation to something more urgent, more personal. References to board meetings and forged permits, a name that appeared with increasing frequency, always in the same context. Thomas. October 12, 1964. The cabin is secure. Hidden floor is complete. No one should find the materials unless they're looking hard. God willing, no one ever will. Clara looked up from the notebook. The fire had burned lower. Outside, the wind had started again, moving through the ridge with slow, purposeful weight. "Mom," Eli's voice was quiet. He was holding one of the flat folders he'd opened on the far end of the table. "This one's different." She crossed the room. Inside the folder, legal documents. Not just survey records, but formal documents typed on official paper, annotated in pencil, marked in the upper corner with a stamp she recognized from the county clerk's papers she'd signed at the auction. Bureau of Land Management, mineral rights claims, filed, or rather not filed, each page marked clearly in Samuel's handwriting, draft, do not submit, not yet. Beneath the stack wrapped in wax paper, an envelope. She almost missed it. It was thin, off-white, sealed with red wax that had gone hard and slightly cracked at the edges. In the center of the wax pressed before it sat a small embossed mark, a circle, an R inside it, and around the R 8 compass points, radiating outward like a star. A compass rose. She turned the envelope over. No name on the front, no address, just the emblem, and beneath it, in the same careful cursive she'd been reading all afternoon, a single line. If you found this, you weren't looking for treasure. You were looking for a way out. So was I. Clara's hands had gone still. Eli beside her read the line over her shoulder. Neither of them spoke. The fire made its sounds. Outside the ridge held its breath. This was the second thing that shifted in her chest that day, something deeper than the first, something that didn't feel like discovery so much as recognition, as if the letter had been placed not just in a hidden room in a mountain cabin, but specifically here, specifically now, specifically for a woman who had just spent 2 quarters on a broken-down dream and needed more than anything to believe that act of desperation had meant something. She opened the envelope carefully. The wax crumbled as she peeled it back. The letter inside was a single page, dense with handwriting dated March 1971. I built the floor to protect what I could. The claims, the samples, the truth. They wanted to turn this land inside out. Strip it, sell it. I said no. They said they'd bury me, so I buried the work instead. If you're reading this, then the cabin survived. That means maybe, just maybe, you're someone who will understand why I couldn't sign my name to their war on this mountain. Don't trust Thomas Reeves, not even if he's dead. The land remembers, so should we. She read it twice. Then a third time slower. She folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands for a moment. Eli's voice came soft, without urgency. "Who's Thomas?" "His brother," Clara said. "I think." "And Samuel, where did he go?" She looked at the notebook still open on the table, at the compass rose on the cracked wax, at the carved letters on the wall and the window sill and the baseboard. 3 rooms. The same 3 letters. A man who had written his name into the bones of a cabin so many times it might as well have been a heartbeat. "I don't know," she said, "but I think we need to find out." That night she didn't sleep. The wind moved through the ridge in long, deep sweeps, and the cabin answered it, creaks and groans and small adjustments that she was beginning to learn the language of. This one meant the north corner contracting. That one meant the window frame expanding. The sound from the back room she still hadn't categorized. It came twice again, before dawn, low and hollow, with that same quality of something beneath the floor, rather than above it. She lay on her sleeping bag and listened, and the compass rose from the envelope turned over and over in her mind. not decoration. She was certain of that now, a signature, a direction. She pressed her palm flat against the wooden floor beside her and thought about the man who had lain in this same space, listening to the same ridge wind, knowing that everything he'd worked to protect was 4 inches below him and dependent on the goodwill of whoever came next. She thought about 50 cents, about the hammer coming down, about the laughter in that grain warehouse. You don't gamble with your last 50 cents unless you're out of options, she said to the dark. The wind moved through the pines outside, long and low and unhurried. In the morning she wrote 2 words in her journal, "Find Samuel," and the stones on the ridge, catching the first pale light of day, waited like they had been waiting for some time. She drove into Hamilton the next morning with Samuel's notebook on the seat beside her and the compass rose envelope tucked inside her jacket close to her chest. Ely rode with his knees pulled up the folder of receipts, balanced on them, sorting through them by date with the methodical patience that had always set him apart from other 12-year-olds. He didn't ask where they were going. He'd learned somewhere in the last year to trust her direction, even when she hadn't fully committed to it herself. The town was small in the way that Montana towns are small, not diminished, just concentrated. A main street of brick storefronts that had seen 3 or 4 economic cycles and survived all of them through sheer stubbornness. A hardware store, a diner with a handwritten specials board, a post office that shared a building with an insurance agency, and at the far end, set back from the street, behind a pair of blue spruce trees that had grown too large for their planting, the public library. Clara parked in front and sat for a moment. She had a name. She had initials carved into 3 different surfaces of a cabin. She had a notebook full of cursive she'd only half read, and a sealed letter from a man who had warned her about his own brother. What she didn't have was context or proof or the faintest idea what to do with any of it. She picked up the notebook, went inside. The library smelled of old paper and forced air heat, and it was nearly empty at that hour. A reading table near the window held an elderly man working a crossword puzzle with a mechanical pencil. Behind the main desk, a woman was reshelving returns with the efficient rhythm of someone who had memorized every inch of the room. Her name tag read Claire Whitaker. She had gray hair pinned in a loose knot and dark-framed reading glasses pushed up on her forehead like a second pair of eyes. She looked at Clara over the desk with the frank appraisal of someone who had seen a great many people come in looking for things they couldn't quite name. "Help you find something," Clara set the folder on the counter. "I'm looking for information on someone who may have lived in this area in the 1960s. Samuel T. Reeves. He may have had some connection to mining operations out near Willow Creek Ridge." The woman's hands went still on the stack of books she was holding. "Reeves," she said, not a question, more like she was tasting the word, checking it for something. "That name means something to you?" Claire Whitaker set the books down. "It means a lot of things to a lot of people in this county," she said, "depending on how old they are and how long they've lived here." She disappeared into the back room without another word. Clara looked at Eli. He gave her a small nod. "Keep going." The librarian returned, carrying a bound archive binder, the kind with a plastic spine and tabbed dividers, the pages inside yellowed at the edges. She opened it on the counter and began turning through sections with practiced familiarity. Reeves Mining was a family operation out of this valley going back to the early 1930s. Marshall Reeves founded it. His two sons were supposed to take it over together. She stopped at a page and turned the binder to face Clara. A newspaper photograph. Grainy black and white, two men standing before a drill rig. The caption read, "T. Reeves and S. Reeves at the Bitterroot Survey site. June 1961. Clara studied the image. Both men had the same jaw square set and the same careful posture of people accustomed to being photographed in a professional context. But something separated them, visible even in the poor resolution of a 60-year-old newsprint image. The man on the left stood slightly in front, turned toward the camera with the ease of someone who expected attention. The man on the right stood back, just slightly. His eyes were on something outside the frame. "Which is which?" Clara asked. Claire tapped the man on the left. "Thomas took over the whole operation eventually." She tapped the right. "That Samuel disappeared sometime in 1971. There was talk, rumors mostly, that he'd had some kind of breakdown. His brother said he'd left voluntarily. Nobody ever confirmed it. Either way, no body, no forwarding address." Eli leaned in close to the photograph. "They look alike." "That's what makes betrayal easier," Claire said quietly, "when it comes from someone who looks just like you." The room held a silence for a moment. Clara asked whether there were any records of filed mineral claims under Samuel's name. Claire checked 2 additional binders and the digital archive index she maintained on a battered desktop computer. The answer was consistent: nothing filed, not a single formal claim or survey submission bearing Samuel T. Reeves as the primary applicant. "The ridge itself," Claire said, tracing a line on a land parcel map she'd pulled from the second binder, "has been dormant for decades. Reeves Consolidated holds the outer perimeter, but the central shelf," she pointed to an unmarked area near the ridge's crest, "never changed hands officially. If someone had filed on it quietly, off the county books, it might still be open." Clara looked at the blank space on the map, a white silence in the middle of everything. "I'd like copies of all of this," she said. "I'll need about 20 minutes. Claire was already moving toward the copy machine. Then she paused, turned back. "You're staying out at the old cabin, aren't you? Up near the ridge?" Clara didn't answer right away. The librarian nodded as if that was answer enough. "If you want to dig deeper into the legal side, there's a man named Reuben Crowe. He's been around this valley longer than almost anyone. He and Samuel were close, from what I understand. He comes into town once a month, but he lives out off Lone Horse Creek Road." She paused. "If you go out there, bring coffee. He doesn't talk to people who show up empty-handed." Clara drove back to the cabin with the photocopies on the seat, her mind moving faster than the road. She spread the copies across the main room table alongside Samuel's documents, comparing the library's land maps with the survey charts from under the floor. They were looking at the same territory from different angles, one official stamped, filed. The other handmade, meticulous, hidden. She worked until her eyes burned, and when she finally stepped back from the table, she saw it. The area Samuel had circled and annotated on his surveys, the geological buffer zones, the silver veining markers, the notations about water tables and drainage, aligned almost perfectly with the blank space on the county land map, the space Claire had called the Central Shelf. He hadn't just been doing research, he'd been building a case, a complete documented, evidence-backed case for preserving something specific. And then he'd hidden it, all of it, under the floor of a cabin most people thought was abandoned. She needed someone who understood why. The drive to Lone Horse Creek took longer than it should have because she missed the turnoff twice and had to backtrack on roads that all looked identical under 6 inches of fresh snow. Eli navigated from the hand-drawn directions Claire had written on a notepad, calling out landmarks, a cluster of 3 pines, a frozen creek, crossing a gate with a broken latch wired shut. The cabin appeared in a clearing beneath old-growth fir smoke rising thin and straight from its chimney. Deer skulls hung above the porch, not decorative, just present the way things in working country often are. A stack of firewood filled the south wall of the porch to the roof line. Reuben Crow was standing at his door before they'd finished parking. He was a tall man, spare in the way of people who have lived physically for a long time. Gray braid, dark eyes that catalog things quickly and without drama. He looked at Clara, then at Eli, then at the thermos she was carrying. He stepped back from the door. Inside, warm, dim walls lined with shelves that held an unclassifiable mixture of books and field equipment and hand-carved figures and stacked notebooks. A cracked photograph on the far shelf caught her eye, 2 young men leaning against the side of a survey truck, grinning, squinting into the sun. Clara pointed to it. He nodded. "Samuel Thomas Reeves," he said. "Smartest man I ever met. Most stubborn, too." He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. "I figured someone would come eventually. Took longer than I expected." She laid the map on his table without preamble, the survey charts from the hidden room, the compass rose envelope, the photograph copy from the library. Reuben looked at each one. He didn't rush. He had the quality she was starting to understand of a man who had spent a great deal of his life in places where impatience was a liability. When he finally spoke, his voice was even. He wasn't just mapping the land, he said. He was making an argument. Samuel believed the mountain had given enough. His family had been pulling silver out of that ridge since before he was born, and he'd watched what it did to the water tables, the elk corridors, the communities downstream. He became an expert in the geology specifically so he could prove what the extraction was costing. And his brother, Clara said, Thomas saw the research and saw the opposite of what Samuel saw. Reuben turned the survey map slowly in his hands. He saw what the land still had to give. He wanted to expand, more drilling further into the central shelf. Samuel refused to sign off on it. That's when things got ugly, Eli asked quietly from the corner where he'd settled with a mug of tea Reuben had pressed into his hands without being asked how ugly. Reuben looked at him steadily. The kind of ugly that ends careers or people. He crossed to the shelf beneath the photograph and opened a drawer. From inside he removed a piece of folded paper, older than the library copies, the fold lines gone soft with handling. He set it on the table beside Clara's map. She unfolded it. Same topographic lines, same grid notation as Samuel's surveys, but more detailed, finer, annotations in two different handwriting styles. Samuel's precise cursive she'd been reading for 2 days now, and the second hand, broader and quicker. He gave this to me the week before he disappeared, Reuben said. Told me to hold on to it. Said he'd come back for it. Clara looked up. He never came back. The room was quiet except for the stove. Would you help us verify what we're looking at? She asked. We're not trying to mine anything. We just want to understand what he found. And maybe, if it's legally possible, protect it the way he intended. Reuben studied her for a long moment with those cataloging eyes. Then he reached across and placed the map in her hands. Use it wisely, he said. Some men leave footprints, others leave unfinished stories. Back at the cabin that evening, with all 3 maps spread across the table, the county copy, Samuel's original, Reuben's more detailed version, something became visible that hadn't been clear from any single document alone. The alignment was precise. The buffer zones, the safe extraction limits, the water protection corridors, they matched across all 3 maps. Not similar, identical. Samuel had checked his own work against a third-party account, and the numbers held. The silver veining on the central shelf was real. But more importantly, the ecological case for leaving it alone was documented, verified, and buried under a Montana cabin for over 50 years. Clara reached into the pile of documents and found a folder she hadn't fully examined yet, one of the rigid book-shaped bundles from the hidden cavity. Inside were legal documents, mineral rights claim drafts, letters to the Bureau of Land Management, survey permits, none of them filed, all of them marked draft in Samuel's hand. And at the bottom of the folder, paper clipped separately, a single document notarized bearing a government seal she didn't recognize. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time slowly, her finger moving under each line. The document predated Reeves' consolidated holdings by 11 years. It designated the central shelf of Willow Creek Ridge as part of an original conservation reserve registered under a county land trust that had since dissolved, which meant that Reeves' consolidated perimeter claim, however it had been filed, had been built around land that was never legally available to them. The shelf didn't just have silver in it. It had a prior claim, Samuel's claim, and it had been there all along invisible, because the document proving it had been under the floorboards. This was the second thing that moved through her like cold water, except this time colder and deeper, and with the particular weight of something that could not be unfound. "Eli," she said. He was already looking at her face. "We need a lawyer." She'd been given a name at the library, Daniel Ferris, an environmental law specialist out of Missoula. Semi-retired, a reputation for taking cases that mattered over cases that paid well. She left a voicemail from the single bar of reception she could get standing on the porch in the cold. He called back that night. His voice on the phone was clipped careful, the voice of someone who had learned to measure his words, because imprecise ones had cost him before. When she described what she'd found, the documents, the drafts, the notarized conservation record, the line went quiet for a moment. "Then you said Willow Creek Ridge?" "Yes." Another pause. "I'll be there tomorrow, before noon." Before, Ferris arrived in an old white Jeep that looked like it had driven through most of western Montana and intended to keep going. He wore horn-rimmed glasses and carried a leather messenger bag that he set on the table without ceremony before he'd fully taken off his coat. He read for an hour without speaking. Clara made coffee. Eli sat on the far side of the table, drawing the ridge from memory in the margins of his notebook. Ferris turned pages with the unhurried precision of someone who understood that details missed early cost everything later. When he finally looked up, he said, "This conservation record is the key. If it's legitimate, and it looks legitimate, the seal is consistent with County Land Trust documents from that period, then Reeves Consolidated's perimeter claim is built on a foundation that doesn't exist." "Can we file on it?" Clara asked. "We can file a preservation claim, not for extraction, for conservation." He removed his glasses and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. "But I want you to understand something before we do. The moment this enters the legal system, it's no longer just yours. It becomes public. And that means Reeves Consolidated will know about it within days." Eli looked up from his notebook. "And then what happens?" Ferris looked at the boy with the directness of someone who didn't believe in softening facts for younger ears. "Then they come at it hard, with lawyers and money and the kind of institutional patience that small claims generally can't match." He looked back at Clara. "You're going to be up against people who do not care that Samuel was right. To them you're a roadblock." Clara's voice was even. He buried the truth to protect it. "I'm not about to let it stay buried." Something shifted in Ferris's expression. Not quite a smile, the precursor to one. "Then let's make some noise," he said. The filing went in 3 days later, while Clara and Eli waited in a diner down the street from the county courthouse. The waitress, who refilled their coffee, had a name tag that read Della and a way of moving through the room that suggested she had been doing it for a very long time. She had a warm face, the kind that remembered regular customers by their orders and new ones by their manners. She brought Eli a piece of pie he hadn't ordered, setting it down in front of him with a matter-of-fact nod. "You look like someone who needs pie," she said, and moved on before he could thank her. Clara watched her go. Something about the gesture loosened a knot in her chest she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. It was such a small thing, a slice of apple pie unasked for, and it meant more than it should have. When Ferris came back from the courthouse, holding a stamped copy of the filing, he set it on the table between them. The paper was official and dense, with language she would need time to parse, but the stamp was clear. Filed, Bitterroot County District, Preservation Claim, Willow Creek Ridge, Central Shelf. Clara held it without speaking. Then she reached for her coffee and said, "What's next?" "Now we wait for them to respond," Ferris said, sitting down across from her, "and they will respond." He was right. 3 days after the filing, a black truck with tinted windows appeared at the far end of the road leading to the cabin. It was there when Clara returned from a second trip to Reuben's place, and it was gone by morning, leaving only tire tracks pressed deep into the snow, and a silence around the cabin that felt different from the silence she'd grown used to, more intentional, observed. She didn't mention it to Eli that night. She wrote it in her journal instead. January 22nd. We have been noticed. The certified letter arrived 4 days later. Reeves Consolidated Holdings, Chief Legal Officer, Leland Croft. Language about mineral acquisition perimeters and federal contest protocols and the advisability of ceasing current activity. Clara read it twice, then called Ferris. "It's bluster," he said flatly. "Mineral acquisition perimeter isn't a real legal designation. He invented it. They're testing whether you'll flinch." "What do? We file a discovery injunction. It freezes any competing claims until yours is reviewed. Buys us time." He paused, and Clara started thinking about who you trust in that town. Someone talked. They knew to send this letter within 72 hours of the filing. She hung up and sat with that for a long time. Someone in Hamilton knew what she was doing. She thought about the diner, about Della, who had been kind to Eli without being asked, about Claire Whitaker, who had provided every document without hesitation, about the man at the auction who had leaned away from her, about the various people she'd spoken to briefly in passing, the hardware store cashier, the gas station attendant, the woman at the county clerk's window. She didn't want to believe it was any of them, but Ferris had been specific. 72 hours, that was a short window, that was someone who knew immediately. She put the thought aside because she couldn't act on it yet, and action without certainty in situations like this caused damage that was hard to repair. Instead, she went back to the stone trail on the ridge. She'd been putting it off for practical reasons. Repairs research, the logistics of basic survival, but Reuben's map had given her coordinates, and she had a clear morning, and the trail of flat stones had been waiting long enough. She went alone, while Eli was organizing the sample jars at the table below. The hike up the ridge took 40 minutes through snow that deepened as she gained elevation. She followed the stone markers without difficulty now they'd become familiar, a language she was learning. At the top where the tree line broke into a high clearing between two old-growth pines, she found what the compass rose had been pointing toward. A wooden post, half-rotted, standing at the center of the clearing. Carved into its face, a compass, rose faded but legible, and at its base, hammered into the frozen ground, a rusted steel tag. Coordinates. She photographed it and stood for a moment in the clearing wind, moving through the pines in long, slow sweeps. Samuel had climbed this ridge, had stood in this approximate spot, had hammered this tag into the ground, knowing he might not be the one who would eventually understand what it meant. On her way back down, she found the second marker. A flat stone, slightly larger than the others, placed beside a jagged boulder near the tree line. Under the stone, another steel tag, different from the first. No coordinates this time, just a date. March 19th, 1971. She stood holding it in her gloved hand. March 1971. The month Samuel had officially disappeared from every public record in Bitterroot County. She carried the tag back to the cabin in her pocket, the way you carry something fragile. That night she was reading Samuel's later journal entries by lamplight when Eli came to stand in the doorway to the back room. He had his jacket on. "There's a car," he said quietly, "down the road. It's been there 20 minutes. Clara set the notebook down. The car was different from the truck. Smaller. A sedan dark, parked just at the edge of the property line, in a spot that suggested the driver knew where the property ended. Its lights were off. The engine might have been running hard to tell from the porch. They waited. After another 15 minutes, the car turned around and left. No confrontation, no words, just presence. And then its absence. Eli stood beside her in the cold, watching the taillights disappear into the trees. "They're not going to stop," he said. "No," she agreed. "So what do we do?" She thought about the journal entries, about the dates, about the steel tag in her jacket pocket with a month and year that matched the disappearance, about the sealed letter that had said, "The land remembers," and the flat stones that had pointed uphill, and the compass rose that had been pressed into red wax by a man who understood the truth needed a direction to travel in. "We go louder," she said. She was inside drafting a message to Rachel Mendes, the journalist Ferris had mentioned, the one who didn't flinch at corporate pressure. When Eli called from the back room, his voice was sharp this time. Controlled but sharp. She was there in 4 steps. He was crouched beside the far wall, the one with the added lumber, the one behind the shelf. His flashlight was angled low, pointing at the floor. One of the boards had shifted, not broken, just moved the gap between it and its neighbor, widened by what looked like the floor settling further in the cold. And through the gap, visible only because of the angle of the flashlight beam, the edge of something, not canvas. Metal, the dull gleam of a tin surface. Clara was on her knees beside him before he'd finished pointing. The board came up without the multi-tool. This time it had simply given up its fixing. The nails rusted through at the base. Below it, deeper than the first cavity, a space that was wider, better constructed, with actual support beams lining the sides. And inside that space, pushed to the back wall and packed around with wadded burlap sacking, a steel box, larger than a shoebox, heavy, padlocked with a rusted latch. She lifted it out with both hands and set it on the floor between them. The padlock was old, but the mechanism still worked, requiring only pressure at the right angle from the multi-tool. The latch gave. Inside, packed tight and sealed in wax paper photographs, black and white, dozens of them, maps with handwritten annotations in a different ink color than anything she'd seen in the main documents, deliberate, differentiated. Signed affidavits witnessed and notarized from names she didn't recognize. Geological testimonies, diagrams of filing processes showing alterations, dates changed, signatures, forged land parcel boundaries, redrawn. And beneath everything else, wrapped separately in oilcloth, a document with a government seal and a date of March 14th, 1971, 5 days before the date on the steel tag she'd found on the ridge. She read it slowly. Her hands stopped moving. She read it again. It was a formal complaint, filed internally within the Bureau of Land Management, naming Thomas Reeves as the primary actor in a scheme to forge mineral rights documentation across 7 separate land parcels, including the central shelf of Willow Creek Ridge. Signed by Samuel T. Reeves, geological surveyor, with a witness counter-signature from a BLM clerk whose name she didn't recognize. At the bottom, in different ink, added later, the pen pressed harder, the letters slightly larger. This complaint was suppressed. The clerk was transferred. I have 5 days before they move to have me committed. This box is the backup. Clara sat back on the floor of the back room and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed. Eli was very still beside her. The wind moved through the ridge outside. The cabin made its sounds, the familiar language of it. The north corner, the window frame, the thing beneath the floor that was now above the floor, in her hands in the room with them. This wasn't just research anymore. This was a crime, documented, witnessed, buried under a Montana floor for 52 years. She looked at her son. Eli, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. I think we just inherited something we don't fully understand yet. He held her gaze. What do we do? She stood. She picked up the steel box. She carried it to the main room table and set it beside the journal and the compass rose envelope and the maps and the notarized conservation record and all the other pieces of a man's life that had been waiting under the earth for someone patient enough to find them. We finish it, she said, and that night, as she was sealing copies of everything into a padded envelope addressed to Daniel Ferris, she heard a sound from outside that stopped her cold. Not the wind, not the settling of old wood, not the ridge moving through its slow seasonal adjustments. A footstep on the porch, deliberate, slow, then a knock at the door. She looked at Eli, he looked at her. The knock came again, 3 times even spaced, with the patience of someone who was willing to wait, and the confidence of someone who expected the door to open. Clara picked up Samuel's journal from the table and held it in both hands, not as a weapon, not as a shield, just something solid and real and true to hold, while the world rearranged itself around her again. She crossed the room, her hand closed on the door handle. She opened it. The man in the doorway was not what she'd prepared herself for. She had been bracing for a suit, a legal collar and a briefcase, or something worse, the blank professionalism of someone hired to deliver a message that wasn't meant to be refused. Instead, she found an old man standing in her porch light with snow on his shoulders and both hands visible at his sides. Late 70s maybe, a heavy parka, boots that had seen real work. Silver hair, cut short, and eyes hazel green, the same specific shade as the photograph in the library, the same shade as the initials carved into 3 walls of this cabin. She knew before he spoke. He said, "My name is Thomas Reeves, and I'm not here as the company." Clara didn't move from the doorway. Behind her, she heard Eli rise from his chair. She held the door at half-width, her body in the gap. "Then why are you here?" Thomas looked at her steadily, the way a man looks at something he's been rehearsing approaching for a long time. "Because I saw your name on the preservation filing. Bennett." He paused. "And because I've been carrying a key in my coat pocket for 30 years, and I think it's past time I stopped pretending I was holding it for safekeeping." The cold moved in around them. The pines beyond the clearing held their silence. Clara stepped back from the door. He came in slowly and stood in the center of the main room, taking in the table covered with his brother's documents, the compass, rose, envelope, the steel box open on the floor. His face didn't change exactly, but something behind it did, some interior rearrangement, like a wall deciding not to hold. Eli stood against the far wall watching. Thomas looked at the photograph copy from the library, the one of 2 young men beside a drill rig. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he reached into his coat and removed the key, old brass, worn smooth. He set it on the table beside Samuel's journal. "There's a deposit box," he said, "at a private bank in Bozeman. Samuel mailed me the key a week before he disappeared. 1 envelope, 1 key, 1 piece of paper that said 4 words if they come, Barry." He exhaled slowly. "I buried it, literally, in a tobacco tin behind my woodshed. I told myself I was honoring his instructions. Really, I was just not ready." Clara looked at the key, then at him. "What's in the box?" "His voice," Thomas said. "Cassette tapes, 3 of them. He recorded everything, the forged filings, the suppressed complaint, the names of the BLM officials who were paid to look away. He recorded conversations I didn't know he was recording." A pause, "including one of me, from February of 1971, before I made the choice I made." Eli spoke quietly from across the room. "What choice was that?" Thomas didn't look away from the table. "The wrong one," he said. Every choice after that was just the wrong one again. They drove to Bozeman the next morning. The three of them, Thomas, in the passenger seat, because Clara had decided without discussion that she was driving. The bank was small, off register, the kind that didn't advertise on the highway. The vault manager required dual identification and both signatures, Thomas's as the box holder, Clara's as the named secondary, a designation Samuel had somehow arranged decades before she existed in any part of his story. She asked Thomas about it on the drive back, the box on her lap. He said he didn't know your name. He couldn't have. He just wrote to whoever comes next on the authorization form and left a physical description of the kind of person who would have found their way here. Thomas kept his eyes on the road outside the passenger window. He wrote someone with nothing left to lose and something left to prove. The bank manager at the time was a personal friend. He kept it off the formal register. A beat. Samuel understood people, Thomas said. He always understood them better than I did. Inside the cabin, Clara opened the box on the table. 3 cassette tapes in individual plastic cases, each labeled in Samuel's handwriting, with a date and a single word. Evidence. Names, Thomas. At the bottom of the box, a leather journal she hadn't seen before, thicker than the one from under the floor, its pages dense with the later years of Samuel's work. And beneath the journal, wrapped in a cloth, the color of old winter sky, a compass. Brass. Handheld. The needle floating free in its housing, unmarked by time. She picked it up. The needle swung once steadied, pointed north. Eli watched her hold it. Thomas, from across the table, he carried that everywhere, said a compass doesn't tell you where to go, it tells you where you are. Clara set it down gently in the center of the table, among all the documents and photographs and years of buried truth, and it seemed for a moment as if everything arranged itself around it, the way things arrange themselves around the thing that matters most. They listened to the first tape that night. Samuel's voice came through the old cassette player Reuben had brought from his cabin, thin with age, slightly warped in places, but clear enough. He spoke with the measured precision of a man who had thought carefully about every word because he understood he might only get to say them once. If you're hearing this, then I failed to protect the ridge myself. That doesn't mean it's lost. It means it's waiting for someone with more courage than me. Thomas sat in the chair by the window, his hands folded in his lap, his face turned slightly away. He had heard this voice for the last time in 1971. The room understood that even Eli, who sat very still with his knees pulled up on the far end of the couch. They forged the filings, they bought the land registrar, they pushed through permits on parcels they had no legal claim to. I documented all of it. I have witnesses, I have signatures. I had a complaint filed and suppressed within a week. What I didn't have was someone to hand it to. A pause on the tape. Background sound wind, a stove crackling. This room, Clara realized, this same room. Don't hate Thomas. I've tried and I can't. I think he believed in the business the way other men believe in a church. He just chose the wrong gospel. Thomas made a sound that was not quite a word. The land doesn't need us to save it. It needs us to remember that it's alive. That's all. Just remember it's alive. The tape ran out. The room was quiet for a long time after. Then Eli said very softly, "I think he would have liked you, Mom." Clara didn't trust her voice. She nodded once and picked up the compass from the table and held it in her closed hand until the metal warmed. Ferris had the tapes authenticated in 4 days. The third tape, the one labeled Thomas, contained an audio record of a board meeting from February 1971. Thomas's voice, young, slightly different in register, but unmistakably him saying words that were clear enough to constitute a legal record. "I know it's not filed properly. I know what we're doing. Do it anyway." Thomas did not ask to hear it. He signed an affidavit acknowledging its authenticity and sat alone on the porch afterward for an hour in the cold. When Clara came out with coffee, he accepted it without speaking. After a while he said, "I thought silence was cheaper than truth. I spent 50 years finding out the real price." She didn't offer comfort because he wasn't asking for it and wouldn't have wanted it. She just sat beside him in the cold and let the ridge stand witness the way it had always stood witness, patient and permanent and indifferent to how long things took. The hearing was in Missoula, in a federal courtroom that smelled of old wood and institutional carpet. The gallery filled earlier than expected. Reporters, environmental advocates, 2 former Reeves mining employees who had found each other through Rachel Mendy's preliminary article and decided after 50 years of separate silence to stop being separate about it. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table in her good winter coat with Samuel's compass in her jacket pocket. She could feel its weight against her ribs. Ferris presented the evidence in chronological order. The notarized conservation record that predated Reeves Consolidated's perimeter claim, the forged filing documents from the steel box, the affidavits from the original geological witnesses, 2 of whom were still living and had agreed to testify in writing, the suppressed BLM complaint, the cassette tapes. When Samuel's voice filled the courtroom for the first time, something happened in the room that Clara had not expected. People stopped moving, not from shock, from recognition. The voice of a man who had told the truth and been buried for its speaking from 1971 into a federal hearing room more than 50 years later. The stillness was the particular kind that means a room is paying its respects. Croft at the defense table kept his eyes on his notepad. Thomas took the stand. He gave his name, his history, his role in the company, and the specific decisions he had made or failed to make across 4 decades. When the opposing counsel asked why he had waited this long, Thomas looked directly at the judge and said, "Because I thought the cost of telling the truth would be higher than the cost of staying quiet. I was wrong about the arithmetic." Then Clara. She hadn't written anything down. She stood at the witness stand and looked at the room, reporters, advocates, officials, the 2 former employees she'd never met, but who had driven 9 hours to be here, and she said what she knew. I didn't come looking for any of this. I came looking for a floor that didn't leak and walls that would keep my son warm. What I found was a man who had spent his whole life learning the language of a mountain and then had to bury every word of it to keep it from being used wrong. She paused. Samuel Reeves didn't just document a mineral claim. He documented a philosophy, a way of understanding what land gives and what it costs when you take more than your share. She looked at the judge. He couldn't finish it, but he left every tool we would need to finish it for him. All we had to do was listen. The opposing counsel had 3 objections ready. None of them landed. The moment that broke the room opened the climax that Clara had not anticipated, the one that arrived without warning. The way true things sometimes do came during the evidentiary review when Agent Waters entered the courtroom and requested a brief recess. She had received in the last hour footage from the cabin's exterior sensor, a small device Ferris had installed without telling Clara specifically because he'd expected what came next. The footage showed the night of the fire, a figure with a lighter, a face turned toward the camera for exactly long enough. Waters presented it on a laptop screen visible to both tables. The man in the footage was named Granger, long-term security contractor for Reeves Consolidated. On his seized phone, a text message from a number registered to Leland Croft's private account. 4 words: make the cabin go. The defense table went silent in a way that had its own texture. Croft stood, sat back down. His counsel put a hand on his arm. From the gallery, barely audible, one of the former employees said something quietly to the other. Clara didn't catch the words, but she understood the tone. It was the sound of something that had been held too long finally being put down. The preliminary ruling came 3 weeks later. The preservation claim was upheld. Reeves Consolidated's perimeter filing was suspended pending investigation of the forged documents. A federal corruption probe was opened. Granger was arrested at a motel outside Butte before he reached the state line. Croft was indicted on 3 counts with more to follow. The mountain didn't celebrate. It just continued being a mountain. Clara understood that now in a way she hadn't at the beginning, when she'd stood at the auction with 2 quarters and a desperate hope and no real understanding of what she was reaching toward. The land had needed her to save it. It had needed someone to stand in front of it and say, this is real, this is here, this matters. That was all. That had always been all. The cabin was rebuilt. Not immediately and not by Clara alone. The community came to it gradually, the way communities come to things that have been proven worth coming to. Claire Whitaker organized a materials drive through the library. Reuben brought 3 men from Lone Horse Creek who knew timber construction. Della Marsh showed up the first Saturday with a box of pastries and stayed through lunch, and then the next Saturday, and the one after that. She didn't apologize in words. She showed up in daylight and worked, which is the only apology that means anything over the long term. Thomas came every day. He was physically able. He was slower than the younger volunteers, and he knew it, and didn't pretend otherwise. He carried what he could carry, and he was there when the sun came up, and there when it went down. Clara watched him once from a distance, standing at the edge of the new foundation and looking at the ridge, and she thought about what it cost a person to spend 50 years being the wrong version of themselves, and then try in the time remaining to be something else. She thought it might cost everything. She thought he was paying it anyway. The Samuel Reeves Conservation Learning Center was built on the cabin's original footprint, with the fireplace reconstructed from the original stones and the windowsill boards still bearing the carved initials integrated into the new frame above the main entrance. Whoever walked in would see them. STR. No explanation mounted beside them, just the letters in the wood in the light. Inside the main exhibit held replicas of the documents from the hidden room. The cassette tapes played on a quiet loop in one corner, Samuel's voice moving through the space at low volume, available to anyone who stopped to listen. On the far wall, a bronze plaque read simply, "In memory of those who told the truth when silence would have been easier." The compass, the brass one from the Bozeman deposit box, was mounted in a small case at the center of the first display table. Its needle pointed north, always north. Spring came to the Bitterroot Valley the way it always does, without announcement, just a slow accumulation of evidence. The snowpack retreated up the ridge. The creek unfroze cautiously at first, then with confidence. The first shoots of bunch grass appeared in the clearing behind where the cabin had stood, pushing through soil that had been cold and sealed for a very long time. On the morning the learning center opened, Clara walked the ridge alone, before anyone else arrived. She had done this often now enough that her boots had worn a slight depression into the trail between the flat markers. The stones were familiar to her. She knew their individual shapes, the ones with lichen, the ones that rocked slightly underfoot in wet weather. She walked them in the early light without needing to look down. At the crest she sat on the bench Eli had helped install the week before. Cedar, facing west. From here you could see the valley below and the adjacent ridge lines, and on clear days the distant smear of the next mountain range beyond that blue-gray and indistinct, the edge of what was knowable from here. She pulled Samuel's final letter from her jacket pocket. She had read it many times now, but she read it again. The mountain never needed saving. It needed someone who would remember it was alive. She reached into her other pocket and closed her hand around the compass. The metal was cold at first, the way it always was, and then it warmed against her palm the way it always did. She opened her hand and looked at it. The needle swung once in the morning air, adjusted, settled, north, unwavering. She thought about the auction house, the 2 quarters on the counter, the laughter that had filled the room and then faded as laughter always does, leaving behind whatever was true before it started. She thought about driving through a blizzard toward something she couldn't see with a child beside her, who hadn't asked to be in this story, but had shown up for every page of it anyway. She thought about a man named Samuel who had loved the mountain so much he buried himself to protect it, and a man named Thomas who had spent 50 years understanding the difference between having money and having a self he could live with. She thought about Della, who showed up with pastries and stayed. About Reuben, who handed her a map and said use it wisely. About Claire Whittaker in her dark-framed glasses, pulling binders from back rooms, understanding immediately what Clara needed. Even before Clara understood it herself, she thought about 50 cents. About how the smallest pivot a hand raised in a cold warehouse, a bit that made a room laugh, can become the hinge on which an entire life turns. Below the bench, the trail wound back down toward the valley, toward the voices already gathering at the learning center, toward Eli, who would be there setting up the first student program, toward Thomas, who would teach the first geology class, toward all the ordinary work of continuing. Clara didn't move yet. She opened her journal to the last page with writing on it, and below the words she'd written months ago, "Find Samuel," she wrote one final line slowly, the pen moving with the particular care of someone who understands that some things need to be written down to become real. He needed us to remember the mountain was alive. We do. She closed the journal. She sat for another minute in the morning light, listening. Below her, the creek moved through its recovered channel. A woodpecker worked somewhere in the fir trees to the east, rhythmic and unhurried. The wind came through the high pines the way it always had, the way it would continue to come through them, long after every person in this story was gone, slow, deep, ancient, carrying nothing it needed to explain. The compass needle held its direction. She tucked it into her pocket, stood from the bench and turned toward the trail, not because she knew exactly where she was going, because she knew exactly where she was. Before you close your eyes tonight, think about this. Somewhere in your own life there is something buried, not under floorboards, but under years, under silence, under the weight of choosing the easier thing again and again, until the harder thing starts to feel impossible. Samuel Reeves spent a lifetime knowing what mattered, and one terrible season believing no one else would. He was wrong. He was just early. What truth have you been keeping safe by keeping it hidden? And what would it mean for you, for the people after you, if you stopped burying it and started building with it instead? If this story stayed with you tonight, share it with someone you love. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. Stories like this one are waiting, and so are you. Good night.